Hi. So, for those of you here last year, you will, well, you'll probably know Bill already, but Bill, you were describing to us your metrics for how you wish to define the way that value is seen, right? Both within Wall Street, within advanced markets, but also the way that they regard all value and the way that perhaps we need to reassess value. And if just look simply through a market prism, how we understand, how we value things which typically we haven't given perhaps so much direct value to, things like school curricula and the way that hospitals operate, to carry on the conversation we've just been hearing. So let's start again. I mean, to start very much from the beginning, redefining value, Bill. Explain what you're seeing here.
That's right. So first of all, we're looking at things that would have an impact of a century with respect to change, right? And as we spoke, I guess it was at FiRe 13, I brought to this group the concept of the research that we had done, which was looking back over 40 years on the S&P 500 and coming away with certain conclusions about how value has shifted over the decades. And this value shift is something that is becoming faster and faster, and it is now, in my opinion, beginning to make this kind of century level of a change in almost everything that we do. And to your point, Ed, maybe what would be helpful, I brought just a couple of slides, is if we used a slide or two that just maybe set the basis of what are we talking about, and then let's talk about those implications. Let's talk about the implications to governments and policy making and GDP. Last year, Mark, Evan, and I talked about innovation and country models, so we can do a little bit of that, and then we'll get into some actual education content, I guess as well. So let's see if we put up the first slide. This one here is the basis of the research, and let me just orient you to it. So in looking back on the S&P 500 over 40 years, what we came away with is there are only 4 kinds of businesses, and it depends on what kind of assets you're leveraging in order to build your business. There are businesses down in the bottom left that we call asset builders. They're the industrials, the hospitals, the hotels, right? They leverage physical assets in order to make their money. You can think about it, it says there, make one, sell one. Just think about that business model. If I'm going to sell a widget, I have to make a widget. My key measure is the utilization of my physical assets, the productivity of my factory, how many shifts am I running, all of that kind of thing. In a hospital, we were talking about it earlier, Ed. What is my occupancy in a hotel or beds filled in a hospital? Those are the key metrics that tell you whether you're making money or not. The second kind of businesses are the service providers. So you could use Deloitte as a great example. We're also looking at the utilization of a physical asset, happens to be a human physical asset. Hire one, sell one. If I want to bill an hour, I have to hire an hour. I hire them in 2,000-hour increments. And if you think about both of those business models, they are beneath what I call the digital divide. They are models that leverage physical assets. And if you think about how fast do those models scale, they don't scale that fast because you get to a point you have to build another factory. Or in my business, you got to hire more people, you got to keep them happy, you got to train them, you got to deal with your turnover. Those businesses don't scale that fast. You cross the digital divide and you get into technology creators, which would be, great example would be anybody doing software, biotechnology. You're essentially creating an IP asset and licensing it. They scale much faster, right? Because the incremental cost to license the same invention one more time is 0, so they can scale faster. Up in the upper right is the network orchestrator. This is where you create a technological platform that other people trade on. Some of those older examples that are around would be a stock exchange, would be some of the credit card companies, and of course the newer companies would be like the e-hailings and those types of businesses. And what we found is that each one of them are leveraging a different set of assets, but their value is dramatically different. And so if you're a company that makes things in the public markets, you're worth 1 times revenue. And there's a distribution curve inside of it, but to keep it simple, you're worth 1 times revenue. If you're a service provider, 2 times. IP licensor, 4 times. And a network orchestrator, 8 times. And think about just the value difference if you could take a company from the bottom left to the upper right. And so what has happened over the 40 years is Wall Street is placing its money in different places. It's placing it with business models that leverage tangible assets, not physical assets. And maybe one other slide to show you is think about it this way in the terms of economic revolutions. We had, the Industrial Revolution, the services, we know the information revolution, and I believe in about 2010, the beginnings of the network revolution. But what's interesting to think about, and it's the most fun way to talk about how value has shifted, is whose pictures were on the covers of all the magazines in these times. The industrialists, the railroad barons, the Newport mansions. The services guys didn't get really too much on the covers, but of course then you go to the information revolution, and it's, Jobs and Gates and all. Where is it now? It's the 30-year-old billionaires, right? And it's so people that are beginning to leverage different assets, moving from physical assets to human physical assets to IP assets to network assets to interactions. And so that's kind of the basis to which then we can have a conversation that says, well, wait a minute. If that is true and value has shifted like that, what does that have for implications to all of these other things we can talk about?
So we're going to just, a simple, it's a blindingly obvious bit of cynical observation. We trust Wall Street, do we, with its valuations?
Well,
and we trust the magazine editors with who they stick on the cover?
Over a long period of time, yes, right? So we looked at this over 40 years, and you'd have to either agree or disagree. My point would be that the public markets are efficient over time. Are they efficient in any 1, 2, 3, or 4 year time period? Maybe, maybe not. But
the year 2000, they were not particularly efficient.
They were not efficient there, but if you look at where the markets are today versus where they are then, you could see that the recovery is strong, and people might talk about the markets being inflated today. In comparison to late 99, early 2000, they're not inflated at all. You can statistically look at that. The other thing, to your point, Ed, is what I do and what we can show in the correlation work that we've done is I'll never agree on what the value of a company is, but I will be able to show you what its relative value is compared to a sister or a different company that may even be in the same industry, kind of doing the same thing, but doing it in a different way.
Okay, so now let's extrapolate that. And are we going to talk about GDP, or should we skip part? Let's do GDP
well,
first.
Let's do GDP. So Mark got me going with this, and in FiRe 13. Mark was the first person when I showed this out, and he said, does this apply to countries? And we got into a whole conversation around the business model of a country, and then the second piece of that conversation was, what about the GDPs that are reported? If value has shifted, if a dollar, can I go backwards if I push that? Yeah. If a dollar is not worth a dollar anymore, in the asset builders, a dollar of revenue, of output, in the public markets is worth $1. In the network orchestrator, a dollar of revenue is worth $8 in the public market. So if a dollar is not worth $1, and we're talking about GDP is a measurement of output of corporations, largely services and manufacturing, is a dollar equal to $1. If the US GDP is 18 trillion and China's GDP is 11 trillion, are they even comparable? When one is doing more manufacturing and has a different mindset around that. So anyway, so here's the results of what we did is we correlated company business model to country GDP, because of course the companies are what's producing most of the GDP. So what do you see here? In the black you see 4 business models, the asset builders, service providers, et cetera. And what you see across with, I think it's 8 countries that we showed here, and these 8 countries make up about 57% of global GDP. If you want to get better coverage, you kind of can't, right? I mean, once you get past India, it starts to get really pretty small. But what you see here in the correlation is based on things that the country does to support those 4 business models. You can see that, let's just pick the United States, but every single one of these correlate. I think the time periods were 2013 to 15, 2010 to 2013, and 2013 to 2015. So they're about 18 months behind us now. In the United States, the policies support those business models above the digital divide. our e-commerce penetration, our kind of open net, things like that. And as a result, we have positive GDP. If you go to China, you see something similar. They can sometimes be an outlier because of their social controls. It depends on the period you actually look at. You can shift off into, let's say, Japan. You can then go to Germany, where it flip-flopped between the years, which is when they were supporting the older businesses, manufacturing and services, their economy was shrinking. Now, there's a lot of reasons why a company is worth what it's worth. My point of view is its business model will tell you an awful lot about why it's worth what it's worth. There's a lot of reasons why a country's GDP changes and everything else. Here's one potential reason as to why. But maybe, Ed, let's talk about some of the implications, because, okay, let's say this is true. If you're a regulator or a policymaker, what would you do? And so Ed and I were talking earlier about, well, let's take e-hailing, because that's a fun thing that we all can kind of even participate. And we know the battles that are going on. You know that I go to CES in Las Vegas every year, and 1 year I can use the e-hailing taxi services. The next year I can't because they've been kicked out. The next year they're back in, right? So there is this battle. And as you all know, it is kind of a great example of the classic battle between the traditional embedded physical business and the new business model, right? And so let's play with taxis and e-hailing, because they're battling all the time. And Ed, in London, right? It's right in all the newspapers. So what does a classic traditional company do or industry do to protect itself against the new entrants? What they do is they go to laws and regulations, and they fight based on things that were put in place many years ago when times were different in order to protect that business and or regulate it, and they sue. And what are the kind of technology-based new business models do? They get customers involved, right? And so what's going on, and many of you probably know in London, there was one point in time where there was the battle, and the new business models won. There was a recent battle that they've kind of lost. Meanwhile, 850,000 residents are signing petitions saying that we want e-hailing because we like it. And the companies and people that are driving the black cabs are saying, this isn't fair. They should have meters, but the e-hailers won that one. They should be able to take the test. I know there's that special test where you have to know where all the roads are. E-hailers say we have GPS. We don't have to memorize the roads anymore, right? And you go on and on. But this would say something different. This would say, well, wait a minute, maybe we should be supporting those e-hailers because it looks like there's some correlation to positive GDP. And then, of course, now I like to talk about economics and business, but now let's overlay the political issue, and then it gets messy, doesn't it? Because in the UK, the majority of the drivers of the black cabs are UK born and bred, and the e-hailers are the immigrants. And so you can just, you can see the mess you can get into that one, right? But you can take that same scenario and throw it to New York and say, well, wait a minute, most of the taxi drivers in New York are immigrants. All right, so take the political piece off of it. Let's talk about the economics and the business as to what grows an economy. And then I loved your question, Ed, earlier. We could look at this in the United States by state almost and start to understand those differences as well. So.
Yeah, absolutely.
So give me a slide and I keep going, sorry.
Yeah, well, you're doing a beautiful job, and it's nice to have the visual aids. But what I like about this, and where I think this kind of throws forward, is obviously we're applying a market concept, and market obviously projects future value as much as it does, or more than it does, current value. And that's what you're describing here, that the market has already decided that future value with e-hailing is a given, and we're going to have to step aside the
even if it doesn't
restraints.
Produce any profits today.
Precisely,
right?
Precisely. So now, where we project that, and I think this is where it gets interesting, is into spheres where the market has not, frankly, worked very well up to now. But you're saying we can apply the similar philosophical principles when it comes to things such as education, such as healthcare, where the market is not really mobilized. Private healthcare, many will argue, doesn't work terribly well in the States, and it just simply hardly exists in Europe because we're mostly state-driven models. How do we apply these ideas to healthcare, for example?
Certainly. So, if we had the full presentation on this 1248 revenue multiplier, I would show you its application to the different industries. There is one slide that I like to use where if you take a number of industry verticals, and then the horizontal is each one of the business models. So the asset builder, the service provider, the technology creator, and the network orchestrator. And you say industry by industry, who plays what role, and what are their values by Wall Street, and where and what industries does the role not yet exist? Where has somebody already come in and taken value? And what's happened with these new tech-based business models is they're inserting themselves in between the physical assets and the customer. And they're saying, I don't need the physical assets. If I have the customer, that's where value is, right? Because value has shifted from owning factories and producing stuff to controlling eyeballs in some cases, right? And so you could take the hospitality industry because it's easy, we all know it. You choose to go stay in a hotel. Does anybody know who owns the hotel? Does anybody care who owns it and who built it? Does anybody care who the service provider is? So we just did the asset builder, and then we did the service provider. Does anybody care who the IP, which would be like brand licensing, is? Yes, now we start to care, right? Because I wanted to stay in an SPG or whatever, because that's my loyalty program. And then who came in above all of that to disintermediate everything else there and give you choices and said the value is you can choose wherever you want to stay, but I'll help you book it, right? And so you have all of those network orchestrators that came in, and then on top of it, the companies that can claim that they have more hotel rooms than all the other hotels added together, but yet actually they have no hotel rooms, right? Mm-hmm. So there's the example of the disaggregation, the deconstruction of an industry. You can do it in hospitals, where in the healthcare industry you've got the online let's connect providers and doctors with patients, or you've got somebody trying to fill beds in a hospital. I can tell you which one is worth more. You can go to the hospitality industry where the hoteliers have bifurcated themselves. They've created the hosts versus the service companies. There is a particular hotel, I try not to talk about company names because they're all our clients one way or the other, so I get myself in trouble. But there's one hotel company in Europe that has always had an asset-light strategy. Don't need to own the hotels, just can use the brand and license that, and they have a revenue multiplier twice all the other hospitality companies.
The President of the United States uses a similar model, as some would argue.
Well, yeah,
we won't get into
let's
that.
Not get into
But
But when you do bring that up, though, let me bring up one other piece when I talk about the four business models. So think about the narrative in the United States about the need to invest in infrastructure, roads and bridges and all of that, and let's spend $1 trillion. I'm in support of that because you need to do that. But if you go back to this model here, you'd say, well, that is needed, but what's also needed is the investment in the other business models, because that over a longer period of time will not be the only ability to create GDP. And people often miss, my message because I'm a tech guy and all that. They think that I'm suggesting one model is better than another, that there's a goodness associated here. There's no goodness or whatever. I'm just telling you which ones Wall Street's paying for and how they've bifurcated value. I believe the answer is you need all four. And there are some companies that are beginning to demonstrate the combination of the four business models and getting better returns as a result.
And there's a kind of tide of history argument here, though, isn't there? I mean, what you're essentially saying is that, kind of like a Marxist will argue for historical inevitability, you're saying there's a kind of market inevitability about certain things being ultimately, will win through. So let's apply that then to, and you've mentioned hospitals, another area, of course, is teaching, education. Right. And particularly education in business and education in economics.
So, again, we could apply it to education from the standpoint of ed tech, right? We can talk about fintech, health tech, ed tech, right? And so that would be the delivery of education online versus in the universities, whether they're too focused on their buildings, and in order to be educated by us, you have to come here, right? Those are the old traditional models. What we've started to look more at is, well, okay, well, let's step back for a minute. Bill, if you're right, if the value has shifted, if it's a fundamental secular shift, that there's more value in intangible things, that the measurements of those are different, that the KPIs, why a company trades at a huge number without much profits, how do we understand that? How do you answer the question to which many traditional people will? When somebody comes to you and says, I cannot figure out how that company could ever be worth that, you have to recognize that they're saying that from the traditional mindset of how you value a business. So if you have a industrial mindset and you can't understand why that company is worth it, that's why you can't. So now let's go take a look. So what's going on with what we're teaching? So we did some quick research. And we kept it for now just in the US, but we will expand it globally. And we basically said, let's look at the Ivy League schools, undergraduate programs, business, and let's look at the top 10 MBA schools in the United States, and what are they teaching? And here's what you see. 91% of the Ivy League business courses are old economy. Remember, the industrial services information is the first two, 91%. That's out of 128 courses. And then the split of the 9 is 82% is kind of the technology creator, which, that's been around for a couple of decades. That's the software and, biotechnology licensing model. And then if you split it down to core versus elective, it's a bit intuitive, right? It says that there's a little bit more of that new stuff in the electives, but we're not teaching it in the core. It's 96%. You can do the same thing for the top 10 US MBA schools, 7%. Otherwise, 90. Now, I agree, you need a foundation. I mean, you need to understand basic finance. But 93%, 612 courses. And then the same thing between that. And then the fun thing is you can toggle. Sorry for you guys taking pictures, but you can toggle. It isn't changing. So you got 6 years of education in the most formidable part. And then, Ed, you say it, but what was the comment about the guys in Silicon Valley?
Yeah, it's a question, there'll be plenty here who'll know more about this than me, but how many MBAs are actually working in Silicon Valley right now? And how many are even sought after? I remember I was asked by a business school in London to go and talk about, how we would attack, new digital technologies. And I'm sitting there and I'm quietly ringing up a few tech guys I know, and we don't want anyone from Harvard Business School, thank you very much. We don't really want anyone with an MBA background. We don't know that they have anything valuable to offer us. Right. And anyway, questions definitely from the floor. Yeah, do you have?
So I think you've raised a great concept about strategy, both for entrepreneurs, companies, and countries. When you get to a network orchestration, Europe was very open, and then Facebook and others sort of took over social media. You have another country somewhere else that was not open. Aren't countries have to be strategic? Because the thing about a network orchestration is you can scale and take over the smaller players. So you have to choose, when you're a country, where you're going to invest, where you're going to back.
So I guess naturally you would have to do that, right? There's always the yin and the yang to any of these. My understanding is that each country has its own values as far as what they do value or don't value relative to openness and privacy and control and lack of control. In fact, in our GDP work, actually some of that comes through to that. So when you look at internet controls, they're stronger in some of the European countries than they are in the United States. In this near-term analysis, because it was only 4 years that we did, the openness is creating a greater amount of GDP. And then, of course, now we can get into the whole debate about privacy versus convenience and all of that.
I guess I just follow with the big tech, headlines we've seen, Google, Facebook, et cetera. Other countries are thinking, do we want Google, Facebook, et cetera, to dominate in our local market?
Right. And then there's a lot of issues that, that we could spend an hour unpacking that one, right? Because are we talking about the lack of competition and the kind of monopolistic issue? Is that the issue? Or is it that there's too much information concentrated with a lack of trust? There's all these different ways that you can get at it. what I try to stay to, although it's fun to talk about it, I try to stay to the work that we've done and what our competency is around it. And that is, and a lot of times people, say to me, well, what's next, Bill? And I said, well, actually, I like to joke and say, I'm not a futurist. If anything, I'm a historian. I just told you what happened over the last 40 years, as evidenced by the S&P. Now, from that, we can draw conclusions, right? But what I do stick with is the models of those companies scale faster. They have actually faster revenue growth and bigger profits as a percentage of revenue as well, so there's that correlation. But it's that model. Now, the challenge becomes, for all of these traditional companies, what do we do about it? I can't tell you the number of CEOs who are struggling with seeing that they have record sales and record profits and the stock's going nowhere. Or a name brand, highly respected company, and there's a couple of handfuls of them that despite the public markets, the stock has gone nowhere in a decade. Why is that? There's articles written about 10 fabulous CEOs not being CEO in the last 18 months because of this of these dynamics, where the capital is moving towards. And so a book that my colleague Seema and I are working on is called The Great Race. And I described it a bit last year as well. There is a race going on. I believe what has happened is the public markets have bifurcated value. It didn't exist before. The bifurcation of value is tangible assets. If you use them to leverage your business, it's not worth too much. But boy, if you can tap into the network and create a network orchestrator type business, it's worth a lot of money. Now, we don't operate in a virtual world exclusively. So this is a race between the traditional physical management teams figuring out how to become more digital, and the digital guys saying, what pieces of that physical infrastructure do I need? Because the end game is equilibrium. But there's going to be this race, and there's going to be a lot of carnage along the way. And I don't think in the future there will be this bifurcation. I think there will be a coming together of companies figuring out how to use all of these business models. And some of those are beginning to emerge. I think we did.
Yeah.
I didn't understand your graph talking about the United States investing a lot in these information technologies, because it seems I can't think of a single technology company that's received a subsidy from the government or public policymaker, but certainly coal, any kind of fossil fuel is getting subsidized because the externalities, the pollution, are not being reflected in the tax, at least in the United States. So it seems to me we have massive subsidies in the United States.
In the opposite direction almost.
In the
right.
opposite direction.
Yeah.
So how do you get those green arrows going up?
Yeah. So what we did was, independent of understanding where GDP was for any of these countries, we started off with asking ourselves, what are the things that would indicate a country is supporting a type of business model, and not necessarily even in industry, right? So when we talk about the tech industry, I'm not talking about the tech industry. I'm talking about business models, many of which are tech-based. But if you're a tech manufacturer, you're an asset builder. You'll actually have about a 3 times revenue multiplier because of the embedded IP, but you're not what I'm talking about. And so those things that we looked at included the amount of digital penetration, the amount of usage of e-commerce from a penetration standpoint, patents issued, percentage of engineers and scientists in the R&D field as a percentage of the population, right? So we looked at those kind of more like bigger picture items that said if these environmental things are true, then that would therefore support the creation of these kinds of models, where these other models are harder to create in countries that aren't supporting that kind of openness. A net neutrality conversation, if you want to have about that, right? That would be another example of that. So it was a little bit further than where you were drawing a closer direct correlation. There was one more question.
There was one. I fear we're overrunning now, and we'll have to do it in the break. Thank you very much. Time up. Cheers.
All right.